visiting Tees Valley Wildlife Trust at some point soon when this pandemic is over, when the lockdown's over. But you know, Tees Valley Wildlife Trust is just one of 46 local wildlife trusts across the UK. Individual areas like Tees Valley, counties, groups of English counties in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well, not forgetting the Isle of Man, the Isles of Scilly and Alderney. 46 individual locally run wildlife trusts coming together as a really strong movement, taking action for nature and trying to bring wildlife back. And the statistics for us as the Wildlife Trust are pretty extraordinary. Together we have around 850,000 supporters, and we actually have more nature reserves across the UK than McDonald's has restaurants in the UK. So in fact, 1,000 more. We estimate that 60% of the British population live within just a 3-mile walk of a Wildlife Trust nature reserve, something that's been absolutely critical for people's physical and mental well-being during lockdown. But the fact is, we don't think that's enough. We're very proud of that, but it's not enough, because the problem is the world is facing a climate and ecological emergency. And today, what I want to do is talk a little bit about that, talk about the state of that emergency and where we're at, and how we need to desperately and urgently turn it around, and the role that we can play here in the UK and the role that nature can play in helping us turn that around, including absolutely everywhere, including, of course, the Tees Valley. So we hear these phrases time and again, climate and ecological emergency, and it's worth understanding just how serious the situation is there. When we talk about climate change and we talk about just how urgent it is to take action on that, one of the biggest concerns around it are the kind of positive feedback loops within the Earth system. So if that might sound a little technical, I'll see if I can try and explain it. It is, of course, you have a certain amount of climate warming that takes place because of fossil fuels that we've burnt and the carbon emissions that we've put into our atmosphere over the last couple of hundred years since the Industrial Revolution. The real concern that scientists have now is that we start to pass various tipping points in the Earth system that means that actually the pace of warming might speed up no matter what we as humans do. So I'll give you some examples of that. Take, for example, the shrinking Arctic ice cap, which I'm sure you've all heard a lot about. But as that's replaced, the white ice in the Arctic is replaced by dark seawater. Believe it or not, that means it absorbs more of the sun's radiation and keeps more of that heat here on the planet rather than reflecting back out into space, which means that as the Arctic ice cap shrinks, so the northern latitudes will warm even faster than they would do otherwise. The same as when we see the tundra, the Arctic tundra, actually thawing, that releases methane from those frozen soils into the atmosphere. And methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than even carbon. And so that's a problem, is that causes it to speed up as well. Or indeed, say, the drying up of the Amazon rainforests or other tropical rainforests around the world. The real concern as they dry up, actually, rather than sucking carbon out the air, which is what they do right now, actually they come to release more carbon. So a real concern there that if we don't act as fast as we possibly can in cutting emissions from buildings, from transport, from industry, and from agriculture, then actually we're going to see climate change speeding up, even if we cut our emissions after that. That's why we've got to roughly halve global emissions of carbon dioxide from those sources that I was just talking about in the next decade, and then eliminate them entirely, really by about the middle of this century, and faster if we possibly can. So it's absolutely critical that we need to do that. Then we talk about the kind of ecological emergency. And the evidence there is also really clear. It's perhaps received less attention in a way than the climate emergency over the last few years. But I think people are starting to finally realize just how serious this is. And it goes way beyond just the loss of the natural world and how we care about that and how we like to have a natural world. If you've not seen it, you really should try and watch Sir David Attenborough's most recent documentary around this. And he puts it very well when he talks about how this really is our big last chance to turn this around and actually put nature into recovery, or rewild the earth, as he calls for it. And the evidence is very clear, sadly. that, for example, WWF recently published a report suggesting that since 1970, we've seen around 68% of wildlife populations suffer serious declines, and we've lost around 68% of our wildlife populations. And that's the average, that's the problem. Actually, it's much worse in particular classes of animals. So for example, freshwater species, we've lost around 84% of those since the early 1970s, from when I was born. And that's no big surprise because we've lost around 90% of our wetlands. Here in the UK, the State of Nature report that was published around this time last year suggests that we've lost 41%, or rather that the abundance of around 41% of our wildlife species has fallen since the early 1970s. And often people talk about, historically, politicians and some others talk about whether there's sort of some balance or trade-off between protecting the environment or protecting the economy. This is entirely wrong. Actually, the fact is, what's very, very clear is the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, not the other way around. We don't have a sound economy in the future if we keep eroding nature, if we threaten the climate. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that learning to live fairly within environmental limits is clearly the next step of human progress. Because if it's not that, then what is it? The science is really clear. Unless we learn to live fairly within environmental limits, there isn't another step of human progress. And so that is the overarching challenge and the big opportunity for us as humanity this century. And of course, the evidence again is very clear. If we can put nature into recovery, if we can take action to stop climate change, then that's going to be critical for improving our soil fertility, for restoring our pollinators, restoring our forests, and everything there that's needed, that's absolutely essential for humans to survive and prosper. And goodness, if we needed an extra reminder of how the welfare, the future of humanity and nature are inextricably linked, it is, of course, COVID. We shouldn't forget that the reason this appalling epidemic came about in the first place is, of course, because of our erosion of nature. You know, 2 decades ago, in things like the Millennium Ecosystem Report, it was being predicted that if we didn't take action to stop the constant erosion of nature and the fragmentation of habitats in the tropics in particular, and of course the international illegal wildlife trade, then we would see ever more escapes of diseases from forests, from tropical forests into human populations. And over the last 2 decades, we have seen more of that happening with SARS, with Ebola, and now COVID as well. So it's very clear that actually, if we're going to be able to move forward as a civilization, if we're going to move forward with the next step of human progress, if actually we're going to have a secure economy in the future, we have to restore nature globally, and we have to restore the climate. So what does that look like globally, and what does it look like here in the UK? Well, scientists are clear now that really what we need to do is roughly around the world put around 30% of our land and sea into recovery by 2030. And that means us here in the UK as well. We need around 30% of our land and sea being put into nature's recovery by 2030 if we're going to turn around these trends which are pointing in the wrong direction. And for us at the Wildlife Trust, that is a very clear goal that we have set now, to make sure we get that 30% of our land and sea into nature's recovery by 2030. Now, the good news is that Prime Minister Boris Johnson did sign up to a global pledge of world leaders to do just that. And that was announced just a couple of months ago in September. The problem is that Downing Street, when they announced that commitment, unfortunately suggested that we're already at 26% here in the UK. And that's absolutely wrong. The only way they got to that calculation was by including all our areas of outstanding natural beauty and our national parks. But that supposes that they're all in a perfect condition when they're not. We know the science is really clear that actually, in many cases, our wildlife is in a worse state in our national parks than outside them. And it's not entirely surprising, because national parks and areas of outstanding beauty are landscape designations, cultural landscape designations, which is useful, but that's not the same as wildlife designations. So at the Wildlife Trust, what we're clear is what we need is a nature recovery network. We need to make sure that we're protecting the very best bits for wildlife now and in the future, and also restoring the bits between them to make sure that we have a network of protected and connected spaces for wildlife into the future, to be able to put nature into recovery. And we're also very keen that this happens actually particularly close to where people live. Of course, it needs to happen in the countryside. We need to create those wildlife corridors and make more space for nature to really enable nature to go into recovery, but also putting it close to where people live, in and around our towns and cities, connecting nature up from the countryside right into the heart of our towns and cities, means we get all the benefits then of making more space for nature. We also improving the space that will be so important for improving people's physical and mental well-being, which is why at the Wildlife Trust we've recently proposed a new landscape designation here in England that we would call Wild Belt, which would mean that we would identify those bits of land that are needed for a nature recovery network, that are needed to allow natural regeneration of our woodland, that are needed for landscape change under higher agricultural payments and so on, that are needed to protect our river systems. All of those areas, let's designate them Wild Belt and protect them for future generations and enable nature to be put into recovery. And it should also include the little bits of brownfield land in and around our towns and cities that perhaps were used previously for industrial uses, but actually, because they've been left alone for a while, have become hidden havens for wildlife. And I know this will be the case absolutely in parts of the Tees Valley. Sometimes those former bits of brownfield land, industrial land, have actually become incredibly important areas for wildlife. These messy areas, the scrappy bits that are often kind of overlooked by some people, but actually are sometimes the most important areas for wildlife. We need to protect those, and again, protect them and connect them up to make sure we can really put nature into recovery right where people live. And we want everyone to get involved in this. You know, it's not just that we need to look to government or local authorities to do this. We want everyone that has a garden to perhaps think about allowing 30% of it to go wild. 30% of our parks in our towns and cities perhaps could be allowed or supported to go wild and support wild habitats. 30% of our school grounds around our hospitals and so on, because again, we know that there will be the huge benefit for people how we do that. We need to use every lever we possibly can to put nature into recovery, and not just nature, but actually restore the relationship between people and nature as we go. And it's worth saying, as you look out onto the North Sea, many of you today, that this is very important in the marine environment as well. You know, the marine biodiversity is roughly estimated sometimes to be around half of the biodiversity that we have in the UK, and it's incredibly important. Often it's out of sight, out of mind, and the fact that it's been dredged in many places and overfished is perhaps hard to always acknowledge and not as well recognised as some of the other problems that nature faces. And yet, if we can put our marine environment into recovery around the UK as well, if we can put our fish stocks into recovery, if we can absolutely make sure that we're seeing our seagrasses and salt marshes being pushed into recovery as well, again, that's going to be fantastic for our marine environment. But that also points to the next thing I want to say, is that often when people talk about climate change and they talk about nature, people talk about them as if they're separate issues, but actually they're inextricably linked. We're never going to hope to solve climate change unless we put nature into recovery. And in fact, we won't be able to put nature into recovery unless we tackle climate change. And nothing illustrates this better than by talking about nature-based solutions. Actually, the way in which we can make sure nature can help us in tackling climate change. Now, people are very familiar with the role that trees can play in doing that. We all understand that if you allow an area to become wooded again, preferably through natural regeneration, perhaps through tree planting, and actually you have trees being grown on that land and being allowed to grow again, people can understand how that sucks carbon out the air. But you know, it's so much more than just trees, and trees have a very important role to play in this. But actually, much more than just woodland landscapes. Actually, our peat bogs are incredibly important as well. Prince Charles once called our peat bogs the tropical rainforests of the UK, and he was right to do so because they're spectacular habitats and they're incredibly important carbon stores. And actually, if we can get our peat bogs wet again, if we can make sure that they are in the recovery, then they will play an incredibly important role in sucking carbon out the air to help us deal with climate change, but also to help put nature again in recovery. And I was talking about the salt marshes and seagrasses as well. Those are habitats that the science suggests are incredibly important as natural climate solutions. Our wetlands generally have a huge role to play in helping us both tackle climate change by sucking that carbon out the air, but also in making sure that our landscapes, our environments are more resilient to weather events as well, making sure that they slow water in our landscape, hold it back during peak extreme weather events, and protect our communities from the worst effects of flooding as well. So it's really very clear now that actually what we need to do, what we can do, what we must do is tackle the climate emergency as urgently as possible, as I said, by cutting emissions as fast as possible from transport, from buildings, from industry, and from manufacturing and so on, and from agriculture as well. Critically important that we do that, and we can do that in ways that also help solve issues around air pollution and pollution of our water and so on. We can do that with clean industry that is part of the solution, and 100% renewable energy that will also be part of that solution as well. But we can also do this by putting nature into recovery, and that will help us again tackle climate change by sucking carbon out the air, but it will also make our societies, our environment more resilient in doing so. And if we can do that in a way that restores that connection between people and nature, rebuilds the relationship between people and nature close to where they live, that also means that actually it's going to be really good for people too, for people's physical and mental well-being, and for our prosperity of our economy. This is critically important, and that's the task that is in front of us. So I couldn't be more pleased that the Tees Nature and Climate Emergency Conference is happening today, and couldn't be more pleased that Tees Valley Wildlife Trust is integral to delivering that. And just looking at the program you've got today, looking at nature-based solutions for net zero, looking at talks around blue carbon, inshore and offshore remedies, looking again at natural solutions, and it's not just trees. I see that from Jeremy Garside, who's Chief Executive, of course, of the Tees Valley Wildlife Trust as well, and the work you're doing across the whole Tees Valley catchment, including around local nature recovery strategies. It's really clear to see that you've got a packed agenda today for this conference, how you can address the climate and nature emergency head on, thinking about those global problems, but actually looking at the local solutions in Tees Valley that will help address that global problem while delivering real local solutions and improving life for people in and around where you live as well. So I hope you have a fantastic conference today and tomorrow indeed as well. Great discussions and the wonderful determination how you're doing that through the virtual world when we can't meet face to face. And just to finish off, I can't wait to try and come up to the Tees Valley at some point when lockdown's over and see the work you're doing in the Tees Valley as part of the Tees Valley Nature Partnership myself. Really looking forward to that visit. In the meantime, I hope you have a fantastic conference. Thank you.